Good afternoon, colleagues. I will call this meeting to order. I will remind everyone that the City of London is... So when I call the meeting to order, this is the time when we all focus in, right? Okay. Just getting ready for December 1st. The City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats and communication supports for council, standing or advisory committee meetings, and information upon request. To make a request for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or call 519-661-2489, extension 2425. We do have a scheduled dinner at approximately 6:30, if that is required. At this point, as we move our way through the agenda, I'll look for any disclosures of pecuniary interest. And there are none, so we'll move to the consent items. Would any member of council like one or more of the consent items pulled? Councillor Rasher.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to address 2.2 and 2.4.
Would you like those pulled, Councillor, or just address them?
If I could just address them, that would be
absolutely fine. You'll be first up on the speaker's list. Anyone else? Okay, Councillor Rasher, 2.2, 2.4.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, first of all, I want to congratulate the staff that came up with this program and the way it's written. It's nicely presented. Unfortunately, I didn't get it until today, so I had to spend my whole part of my morning and afternoon, but I'm not complaining about that. The fact is that it was there. However, Mr. Chair, I am concerned, and perhaps staff could help me out with this. I think it's relatively complete, but one of the things that I find in this being a smart city, there is no place in here where some of the needs are mentioned. So maybe this is a different level that I don't quite pick up on. And I'm talking about diversity and inclusivity. It's absolutely, the word is not mentioned even once in there. Maybe there's no room for this. Maybe it's a different pattern that we are looking at. I'd like to know that, because I believe that in a smart city, diversity and inclusivity should be a part of it. Secondly, there is nothing mentioned about social issues such as homelessness and so on. Perhaps those things don't belong in here. So I would just like somebody to comment on that for me, please.
Sure. So this is on 2.2, and I understand that Mr. Fleming has a very brief presentation prepared that we could all view, and I think since a question has been asked about this consent item, it'd be appropriate for you to do so. And Mr. Fleming, if you could address the specific question at the same time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you said, this is a brief presentation, and certainly glad to take additional questions, and I'll address the question that the councillors asked at the end. You'll see right on the very front page, draft is important to understand. This is a draft, and we will be circulating it for more feedback. It's about using innovation, data, and technology to make our lives better, as you can see on the cover page. And in fact, this first slide, I think there's a lot of smart city strategies that are out there that talk about all kinds of technology, but ours is very much about using innovation, data, and technology to make our lives better. And that last piece is really important. The Smart City strategy itself was prepared by a number of partners, includes the City of London. You can see the different service areas there. The London Economic Development Corporation, Larry McKinnon is here from LEDC. London Hydro, and LargeNet, which includes the major institutions in London. So why is it important for the city? Well, these smart city strategies are being completed across the globe, and there's a reason for that. They help to make better decisions, both government and residents and businesses. They can offer services that these cities that have these strategies in place that are less expensive, more convenient, more inclusive, more accessible, and better experiences. And they really do help in terms of attraction and retention and a deliberate plan to maintain competitive ground. Our approach is not to provide a long list of cool technological projects which would be quickly out of date or narrow in scope, but really it's about setting the environment and facilitating the development of smart city initiatives by the private sector, institutions, utilities, and others. You can see that we're already undertaking a lot of smart city initiatives. I won't get into those in any detail, but it includes those that are listed here, and there's some really good stuff going on already. Here's the vision that is shown in the smart city strategy, and it's all about, again, using innovation, data, and technology to make our lives better, strengthen our economy, protect our environment, and deliver government services more openly, efficiently, and effectively for all Londoners. And perhaps we need to include something to Mr. Usher's point in the final version, which relates to social issues or social considerations, community considerations, and the way that smart cities can help us there. Smart city thinking is at the core of any smart city strategy, and you can see here those clouds really represent the pillars of smart city thinking. They include digital government, open government is really key, connected community, citizen experience, so it's how do you experience, or resident or business experience, how do you experience the city, how can you customize your own needs, innovation, efficiency, effectiveness, and collaboration partnerships. Those are the keys of smart city thinking. And when you run traditional services through smart city thinking, you end up with services that are more effective, better experiences, allow for better decision-making, more inclusive, accessible, convenient, and less expensive. So as opposed to a long list of technology projects, the idea here is a strategy that has 3 prongs. Prong 1, create a culture of smart city thinking. Prong 2, develop our smart city infrastructure. And prong 3 is to use that environment, kind of stir the drink by facilitating smart city initiatives. I've got 2 more minutes. In terms of driving the culture of smart city thinking, creating a smart city office would be one piece. Promoting London as a test bed for smart city innovation. Engaging the public in hackathons and tech discussions, establishing a smart city strategy implementation committee, so this is on the community as a whole, and then creating a civic accelerator to bring the private sector and the public sector and institutions, et cetera, together. Second prong is developing the infrastructure, so that's the ICT infrastructure itself, expanding our data collection, and then managing that data and sharing it more openly. And then finally, the third prong is all about, as I said, stirring the pot, facilitating and allowing the private sector and these other partners to develop the types of smart city initiatives that we'd like to see deployed out there. So next steps, we're going to be circulating the strategy, preparing an implementation plan. So we're going from strategy to an actual plan, which will identify specific moves forward, prioritizing them, costing them, and identifying who does what. We've indicated here that resources will be allocated in city planning during 2019 to help develop this. We'll revise the smart city strategy based on the feedback we receive, and we'll return to council for approval of the strategy that's finalized and the implementation plan. And then we'll be incorporating any of those initiatives and those pieces that are in the implementation plan in the 2020 to 2024 multi-year budget. So as I said, I think to the question that's asked, I think there is an opportunity to include that notion of diversity and inclusivity in here, and certainly that idea surfaced through the Smart City Challenge and the concept of welcoming newcomers to London and using smart city technologies to make that happen.
Councillor Usher.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Fleming. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm glad to see that Mr. Fleming has, I won't say agree with me, but I think that he will try and accommodate my thinking. I think it's very important because we got 20% of the population being visible minorities and a lot of newcomers. We have more than that as newcomers. A lot of this achievement will be done by some of these newcomers because they're the ones who are going to bring the innovation from abroad and help those who are here to make this possible. So I just want to be sure that we do not forget diversity and inclusivity in anything that we do around this horseshoe. So when you are ready, Mr. Chair, then I'm just going to briefly mention what I wanted to mention on 2.4.
Please go ahead, and if you wouldn't mind, moving 2.1 through 2.4. Thank you. Seconded by Councillor Park.
Yeah.
And go ahead, Councillor Usher.
So my question is the same, very quickly, with respect to the convention center. I've been here 18 years, and I'm sure that in the convention center, on the board, we've had people of different ethnic origin in the past. I can't remember any specific one, but I don't want us to lose that, Mr. Chair. I may not get the opportunity to mention these things between now and the end of November when I leave here, and I don't have any intentions of participating or interfering with municipal politics at that time. But I just need to remind everyone that we made a promise, we made an agreement, we have a strategy that we are going to include diversity and inclusivity in everything that we do, including our boards and commissions. And one last thing very quickly with respect to 2.2. Can I ask Mr. Fleming a quick question? Are we going to send this out to the advisory committees also? That was not mentioned in the, I didn't see it mentioned here.
Mr. Fleming?
Yes.
Councillor Morgan and Park.
Sure. Now that Mr. Fleming made the presentation, I actually do have a question on this. In the next steps part of the document, you go through 1 through 6, makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I think may be missing as a 7th step or a kind of a future progress, and I think is important at the stage we're going out and consulting people on the draft plan, is really what does measuring success look like? What are we going to do to ensure that we're reporting out on many of the good things that are listed in, you know, the 1 through 3 parts of the strategy? Much like what we did with our strategic plan, where we had reporting out and metrics. With the smart city strategy, I see that as maybe even a real-time digital reporting out to the public, much like cities like Edmonton have with, you know, their dashboard systems and shows kind of the data in real time. As we do all of these great things, it would be great to have a sense of what the stakeholders think about how they want to be updated on how these things are going, where the progress is, what's ahead, what's behind, what can we do next, and the progress on the strategies. So I don't think I need to change anything here, but I leave that with Mr. Fleming and his team as they go out and consult stakeholders about. That is something that I would like to see in the final strategy, is how are we going to deal with that reporting back piece on how all of these things are going. And I think consulting with the public is a good way to find out how they would like to receive the information back.
Councillor Park.
Thank you. Through you to Mr. Fleming, you made mention briefly, and please correct me if I didn't hear you properly, about the implementation of a smart city office. Was that something you had said? I just want to make sure I heard it right.
Yes, that's in the strategy, and that would be one of the measures with respect to driving the culture of smart city thinking forward. What was clear from the consultants as well as the steering committee is this kind of work doesn't happen effectively off the corner of desks, and it would be important, I think, to keep that small and minimalistic as possible, but at the same time have a focused office that is looking to drive this forward.
Thank you. I think that that's a good idea, and thank you for mentioning the side of desk work, because that doesn't really get us as fast and as far as we would really like to see. I just wonder if from a practical perspective, if you could outline some preliminary thoughts on the function of the office. Would it be to just align different business areas of the City of London with the private and public, or how would that kind of operate going forward?
Mr. Chair, I have a second presentation. No, just kidding.
Would you like us to lower the podium for you?
Okay, so these are the items. I really glossed over it, but the types of things that an office would participate in. So, of course, taking the strategy and moving it forward, and part of that is getting deep into the organization here. So, getting into all of the different service areas, educating, coordinating, training on smart city thinking, helping the service areas to drive these smart city initiatives through their service areas, explore what can be done, understanding best practices that are out there, and helping them to weave smart city thinking into their business plans. Bringing together the tech sector innovators and service area leaders to collaborate. So that's the Civic Accelerator and helping to get that going. The infrastructure pieces, working with IT and other maybe private sector groups or procurement. And you could tell a lot of this is collaborative work. It's not just this office doing this thing, but is providing leadership, and others are bringing others in to actually deliver on some of this. Identifying gaps, so understanding where there are gaps and high demands for smart city services. Promoting and branding London as a great place to do business because of the smart city, and also a place that can be a test bed for smart city testing and exploration, innovation. Measuring smart city progress would be done by the office as well, as pointed out by Councillor Morgan. And essentially being the single window for that sort of thing. So you'll see through these other 2 through 5, even helping support the community committee, that's the steering committee. That would be a job that the Smart City Office would be involved in as well. So there's lots to do, and important that there's a focus there to actually get it done.
Councillor Van Holst, Hopkins, Turner.
Thank you. Well, this is exciting. And I appreciate that a list of technologies is not really a strategy. However, I think it would make a good appendix because it might save us from reinventing the wheel and looking at things that might already be there. I think it's also nice to see and be able to see what's happening at other places and what's been done, what is being done, and that can give us sometimes the directions to go in or spark our own types of innovations. So I do think having a good sense of what's out there and what has been done is also worthwhile.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, and through the chair, I guess this question may go to Mr. Fleming, and it's regarding the data, and I understand we're going through a strategic plan. What's the process like when it comes to looking at security and privacy, and who controls that? Does the city take the lead, and where does that conversation happen through this process?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I whipped through it just because I was trying to go fast, but I want to point out, I think that within the City of London, there's many people that have been at the table and providing leadership beyond myself, for sure. And that includes Matt Daly and his team in IT. We've got Rosanna Wilcox here, Community and Economic Innovation, and Gary Stronghill, most recently in Environmental Engineering Services. So one of the things that we talk about in terms of the data side of this plan, we talk about data as infrastructure because it really is a platform or a foundation for these smart city innovations and the projects and programs that take place. The idea of having very strict measures in place to protect confidentiality. So while the idea is to provide open government, open access to data, the other side of that is to make sure that there is security and privacy, and setting up protocols around that is a really important part of what's already in place, but also moving forward as we become more and more open in the sharing of our data.
Okay, Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thanks to my colleagues for raising some good questions. Are we talking specifically, to this point or to the points in the consents as a package?
Right now, the consents have been moved collectively, and so you can speak to any item in the consents.
Great, thanks. Specifically to the smart city first, I think you point out quite a bit, Mr. Fleming, about the collaboration as being important and taking a look at those data sets. I'm glad Councillor Hopkins raised the point about that privacy. I think the key to a lot of this is being able to get not just municipal data sets, but those collaborative partners and their data sets to start working together. I remember having access just within my own shop to multiple databases that weren't necessarily aligned or related to each other, but once you started putting those together and asking a query of the data and taking this piece over here and this piece over here, you started to create this really fascinating picture of information that you wouldn't normally have access to. So if you could imagine using paramedic services data and roadworks data, and having that instantly in a real time be able to route ambulances to avoid any of the interruptions. And there's some discussion about Waze, for example, is one of those pieces. But you can start to really layer that on into multiple things. If you took a look at what LEDC had and the hospitals had and all our institutions and the educational institutions, and having that available not just for government consumption or our stakeholder consumption, but also all three sectors, government, nonprofit, and private enterprise. And that can help foster innovation on all three of those fronts and really create some really interesting and fascinating products we couldn't possibly consider. Probably the best open data story is about the guy who had a gold mine and did all this prospecting and couldn't find anything. Had really poor success. And then he decided to do something that nobody had ever heard of. He opened up his data set and said, okay, if anybody can help find something in this, I'll help share the profits associated with that. And then suddenly, through hackathons and things like that, people who were able to consume open data were able to put that all together and find where the veins were in his prospecting area, and it became a really productive mine and was able to share with the people in that community. So, so great lessons here. I'm very excited to see that. Back to the surplus and deficit policy. I did have a question with respect. I think we've had a little discussion, perhaps Ms. Barbone, about right-sizing those contingency fund balances and making sure that the reserves are appropriately sized and they're not too large. When we speak about, especially on the water and wastewater ones themselves, and using reserves to help fund that infrastructure gap. Is that the appropriate way to address infrastructure gap, or is core funding the way that we address that? And how does that work back and forth between the reserve and core funding? And at what point do we say that the reserve is appropriately funded? And do we have consideration for where in any of those three policies that once we've hit the appropriate reserve funding levels, what next? Where do we go to divert any surpluses that might be accumulated at that point?
So through the chair, obviously it's a very long-term strategy to get those balances towards our target balance. So I would suspect that once we reach that, we would have another policy that we would be bringing forward when that does occur over time to change the policy to now have a different strategy. So at this point, we haven't addressed that because it's really as we try to work towards that. Definitely from the infrastructure perspective, that is something that I suspect that through the multi-year budget in 2020, that we will have a much longer conversation about what is the right target. So one of the things that we're currently doing right now is looking at our reserve funds and trying to determine what those targeted balances are specifically with respect to infrastructure. So as we're working on our updated infrastructure report, we will get a better sense of how large that gap is to be able to then identify how much of that we should have set aside to assist us in getting there. So this is a bit of a work in progress in terms of how we get to that point. So for right now, we've looked at trying to set it up appropriately to mirror the system that we have for the tax supported on the water and wastewater side to get us going and to start setting things aside. That's really from the contingency perspective to be able to allow us to have the working funds and meet the commitments that might be outside of the norm. So the next part is then looking at what the right balances are based on the infrastructure gap specifically and trying to determine what the target balance is going to be specifically with respect to infrastructure. So that's going to happen throughout 2019 and 2020 as we get a better sense of what the gaps are and then try to look at the appropriate amount that we would try. So the question will be whether it'll be, 40% all the way to 80%. I mean, you could pick a percentage and then there's other ways that we'd want to get there because we also we want to find the right balance so that we're not overfunding at the same time. And based on how we look at our capital plan, we'll have all of them work in its entirety together.
That's for your worship. Thank you, Ms. Barbone. Then I guess if we were to look especially at that capital works within wastewater and water from on a year-to-year basis, we would look to say what would be the mix between levy financing and reserve fund financing towards those capital works that might be scheduled in the year. Is that correct?
Any other speakers? Okay, the consent items have been moved by Councillor Usher, seconded by Councillor Park. There are no additional speakers, so I'm going to call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 15-0.
Okay, let's move then to items for direction, 4.1 and 4.2. Any interest in pulling these recommendations separately? Looking for a motion, moved by Councillor Usher, second by Councillor Zaifman. Any speakers? Councillor Morgan?
Yes, just on the Hyde Park Business Association Board of Management, Mr. Tom Delaney will be a great asset to the Board of Management. He's attended several meetings as an observer, and I think he'll be a great benefit. And I think council will see that when the information comes back on how the first year went. So,
Councillor Hopkins.
Yes, I just want to speak to the resignation at 4.1. I understand that the process that will be undertaken will be going forward with the new applications for the new boards and commissions.
So lots of information about that coming soon, and an opportunity for people to put their name forward to serve. Councillor Morgan.
yes, I forgot to say the most important part about the Board of Management thing, and that is, it's just a letter. It probably requires a motion to appoint this person, so I'd be happy to move that
Okay,
tonight.
so we've got a motion to, as I interpret it, to receive and move forward the recommendation. It was moved by Councillor Usher and seconded by Councillor Zaifman. Okay, so I think you're covered. All right. Any other speakers? Councillor Usher.
If Councillor Morgan would like to move it, okay.
Any other speakers? Okay, let's call the question. And we're voting.
Closing the vote, the motions carry 15-0.
Okay, colleagues, any deferred matters or additional business? Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Your Worship. I have a couple of matters of additional business. I did forward them to, or ask the clerk to forward those to our colleagues. One's a request to the, to London Hydro. So it's a motion that Councillor Morgan and I have drafted, and he agreed to second that motion.
Okay, as we're all quickly checking your email, Councillor, would you give me a sense of what that motion is? For your colleagues' sake, we'll look for it on screen as well if it's provided to the clerks. I understand you're moving it. It's being seconded by Councillor Morgan.
Okay, yeah, it's just looking for the updated version. Have you got that, Councillor Morgan?
I don't have a copy.
Okay. Okay, so, and here's the motion, that London Hydro be requested to provide the shareholder, London City Council, with a breakdown of the estimated costs London Hydro will absorb by work required for the bus rapid transit project, and further, if those costs will impact the London Hydro ratepayers.
Okay. I'll give our colleagues an opportunity to review that. I'll look to Councillor Morgan. You've seconded this motion related to rapid transit? Okay. Any speakers? Yes. Councillor Usher, Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, with all due respect to my colleague, this seemed to be a very in-depth request that unless we're prepared to sit down and talk about this and get a lot of information from staff, I'm very concerned about making this motion at this point in time. Do we have another SPPC meeting before the end of the year? Because I don't want to do this right now, Mr. Chair, so I got a lot of concern about it. I would like to know more details about this.
One option, Councillor, would be to refer this motion to the 19th of November. That's the next SPPC meeting. That might provide a little bit additional time, if that's something you'd like to do. We're at committee, but it is committee of the whole, and I often chair committee of the whole as council because there's so many of us. And if there's a seconder for that, then we can have discussion about both motions and decide which direction to go. Would you like to move that to the November 19th?
And yes, Mr. Chair, I want to I want my colleague to understand that I'm doing this with respect to his request. I don't know what these are, and I can't vote on these right now. So I'd like more detail before I can vote on it. So I would like to refer this to the next SPPC meeting.
Okay. Let's just see if there's an appetite for that. Is there a seconder to ask that this request that's being brought forward by a couple of councillors be moved to the next meeting? I'll go to you in a second, Councillor Park. I also have Deputy Mayor Hubert, so I'll go to you next.
Thank you. Just for the public that may be watching, there's some confusion because this all happened after the meeting had begun, so that's why we're all kind of, what the heck's going on right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone watching from home, this is a motion that hasn't arrived in my email yet. This is the first that I've seen it as chair of the committee, and I think a number of colleagues are in the same situation. It is up on screen now. It should be being broadcast. Anyone watching the YouTube channel. I'll go to Deputy Mayor Hubert, and I'll go to
I just want clarification of what the intent of the motion is. Is this an intent, it is the intent through you to our esteemed colleague, that Hydro would bring this information back at some time in the future, certainly not in probably the next 4 weeks, because it seems like it will require some significant work for that to happen. In which case, I have no objection to the request. It's probably what the horizon of response is.
just before we move forward with that, and just let's stay, sort of just as together as we can here. Yeah. Councillor Usher was moving a referral.
I want to make a point.
Yeah.
I was not moving that referral. I was moving another referral for another motion that Councillor Van Holst dropped in on us at 4:13.
There was another email I'm aware of that has just come through the clerk's office. The clerk has been tied up in training for the bulk of the day. Her training shift ended just after 4. The meeting convened at 4, and I know that Clerk Saunders is working as quickly as she can to get information to councillors, even these last-minute motions. So you don't want to speak to this motion? You want to speak to the other motion that came in our email?
Yes, my motion was to the other motion.
Okay,
so
let's
this
deal
one
with them separately then.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to do.
Let's call this one the London Hydro motion.
Right.
And I'll look for any speakers on London Hydro. Councillor Hopkins, do I have you? Okay. Yep.
Thank you for the clarification, because I was looking at a different motion here. And I think I would like to know a little bit more about the intent. If we are at a committee, if I can ask my colleague that
Sure.
question.
Why don't we go to the mover of the motion? Could you give us a sense of why you're asking your colleagues to support this direction?
Absolutely, Your Worship. And sorry, I usually work on my motions on the weekends to have them ready for the agenda. But we had the long weekend, and then all of a sudden I realized I'd missed the deadline. So because London Hydro will take on many tens of millions of dollars on capital works with the BRT, the ratepayers are going to have to cover those costs by increased hydro bills. Now, we could avoid that. Oh yes. So any time that London Hydro pays for an investment, yeah, anytime London Hydro makes any investment, in terms of capital, they are allowed by the regulation to recoup that from the ratepayers, along with a regulated return on investment. So this is how that company works and makes a profit. Now, so there's going to be quite a bit of that going on for the rapid transit project because they're going to have to be making a lot of those investments. We could avoid those increases if the city just paid for that, but then the taxpayers would be covering those costs. So it would balance out, but not quite, because London Hydro has a higher interest rates they have to pay. They can't borrow as low as interest rates as the city, and they have that regulated rate of return that they charge. So here's my concern is that by having London Hydro pay for these works, there's going to be a number of millions of dollars more that this will end up costing Londoners. So it's essentially going to increase the cost of living. Here's why that's a concern to me, is that we've got many people on fixed incomes in London who at the end of the month don't have enough money for food. And if their cost of living goes up, then they go without food longer. They go hungry longer, and that's what I wanted to avoid. So what I'm hoping to do with this information is just see whether or not the magnitude of that opportunity is worth pursuing. We can essentially save money for Londoners if we potentially look at a different way of funding some of those things. I want to see.
Councillor Hopkins has
see
the
that.
floor. I think that she's satisfied with the information you provided based on your motion. I'm going to hand things back to Councillor Hopkins, and then I have a speaker's list.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the explanation. I have a second question then. So what are the timelines that we're looking at to have this information? Is there a timeline?
Well, do you have a time horizon, Councillor, in your motion?
Okay. I'm not necessarily requesting one in this, but I think London Hydro will be able to provide some estimates fairly soon on this.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Squire and Helmer. Anyone else?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you. I think there's two issues. The first is, should we refer it so that Hydro can provide us with information about how difficult it will be to provide this information and what it is? And I think that's a legitimate question. I cannot believe, and I'll be very surprised if this council votes not to allow a fellow council member to have someone provide us with information. And I hope that's not what we're going to be debating, because it's very important, I think, to have all the information you can have with regard to a particular issue. And I think this is, I don't need a lot of explanation on this motion. Very straightforward to me. What the councillor is looking for is looking for information. So it will be very telling to me if we don't allow a councillor to get information.
Councillor Helmer.
Well, although the motion didn't have a ton of notice, certainly we're familiar with the question because we've talked about it before here at committee. I recall the city engineer responding to Councillor Van Holst at that time that who's going to pay for what in terms of the utility relocations and utility renewal was a matter that was being negotiated with London Hydro. I'm not sure when that was. Maybe it was not a year ago, maybe a couple months ago. I'm sure Councillor Van Holst remembers when he brought it up last time. City engineer's not here, but it looks like Mr. Stanford is sitting in her place. So I just wonder if he'd want to comment on this issue.
Mr. Stanford.
Through the chair, I don't have any of that knowledge from before, but I'd be happy to talk with the city engineer tomorrow when she's back to determine what has been achieved with London Hydro, but that would be basically a normal request on projects of this magnitude, working with London Hydro.
I think, Councillor, it would be reasonable to expect that information to be available tomorrow night before Council. You have the floor, Councillor Helmer.
Yeah, so, I think it is important that people understand, how different projects are paid for and who should pay for them. And certainly any utility infrastructure renewal that happens at the same time as bus rapid transit should be paid for by the utilities. That's the purpose. So you can take advantage of coordination to save money. We're going to be taking up the road anyway. We'll be moving utilities anyway. Go in there and replace the infrastructure that's aging and needs to be replaced anyway, and you can save some money. I think that's smart. That doesn't mean that taxpayers should start paying for the cost of any utility, including London Hydro. So this is something, as we know, that gets negotiated between all the various utilities, not just London Hydro, and the city, which is to say, we're going to be working on this project. How are we going to distribute and apportion the costs? What is appropriate for infrastructure renewal, and what is a result of the BRT project or any road construction project? We do it when we're dealing on railway crossings, where we're dealing with the railways, And that's not something where you say, tell us your negotiating position. Come here and give us your, now it's a bit odd because with London Hydro, we are the shareholder, right? And I think this is why, for example, Councillor Van Holst is bringing it to committee to have a council resolution rather than say, London Hydro could just send us this information, right? They have their own board, they can make their own decisions about whether they wanted to release this information. What Councillor Van Holst is doing is coming to committee to get a council resolution as the shareholder to ask for the information, which is different. So I know it seems like a sort of straightforward request. I thought when Councillor Squire was on the list, he was going to say, I'm not going to support it because there's no notice. But I guess not. He does support it. I myself am not sure that it's really a good idea.
Point of order, Councillor?
I don't need another counselor to comment on my motive, my thoughts, or by implication, whether I'm doing the right thing, which is how I take it.
Privilege?
Personal
Counselor?
privilege, yes. I take that very seriously, the comment that was made. Please make your own comments and let me make mine.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Helmer?
Sure, I'll continue making my comments. So I'm not sure that it's so straightforward. I don't think it's necessarily a good idea before we've actually decided the apportionment of the costs to have that disclosed in public session, for example. So, there are significant costs there. My understanding from hearing the city engineer talk about it before is that the coordination of those projects together is going to save, overall, it's going to save money. So I think it's smart to do that. But I do not support in principle that taxpayers should pay for something that is a ratepayer supported expenditure. So the idea that Councillor Van Holst is saying, I'd like to know what it is so we could finance it differently, I would never support that. So why do I need to know that information? Regardless of what those costs are, that should be paid for by London Hydro and the Hydro ratepayer.
Any other speakers? Councillor Morgan? Anyone else?
Yes, I just wanted to remind colleagues that this is not the first time that Councillor Van Holst has brought this up, and I agreed to second his motion because at one point, I can't remember if it was Corporate Services Committee or a previous meeting of another, might have been council, he was suggested to bring it up. It's a shareholder matter, bring it up at SPPC. I talked to him after the meeting. I said, if you're going to bring something up at SPPC, I'll second it and make sure it gets on the floor. It's very reasonable to me that he would bring this here because it is a shareholder resolution, as Councillor Helmer has explained. And I, like Councillor Squire, am very supportive of a colleague getting information. I would say I would render judgment on what to do with that information after I saw it. And I know there was some discussion on what the motives were, what the intent was, that sort of thing. I certainly would make no intent with the information until I saw it and would decide what to do with it at that point. But I certainly support the councillor's request for information. I think it shouldn't be a surprise that he's asking it because he's mentioned this a few times and this was the appropriate place for him to land his actual inquiry.
Any other speakers? Councillor Ridley?
Thank you, Mayor Brown and councillors who spoke before me. On this matter, on the face of the motion, I think this is one of the instances where I'm certainly supportive of the motion as it stands. I think it's some of the discussion which is a bit more difficult. I think that this is good information for us to receive, but I also want to caution people about what that information means and what the implications are, as Councillor Helmer has indicated. So I think that as councillors, we are one voice. We don't have power as a single person to go and demand information. This has come up time and again, whether it's with civic administration, the police board, or boards and commissions. And this is the method that we have to get that information. I've always supported colleagues who say that they want more information, and so in this case, I'm going to support that information. I'm going to trust that between the board of London Hydro, civic administration, that information will come back to council, and then if people wish to make any further discussion or comments, we can deal with it at that time. So I think it makes sense when people want information. Sometimes this is the only way that we can get information, and that's our job, is to have all the information we need to make decisions. So I'm going to support it for that reason.
Thank you, Councillor Ridley. Councillor Usher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I don't, like everybody else, this came up before. I don't have a problem with getting the information. I just wanted the process that we're going through. Why are we going to London Hydro? We've got the city that's working on this project. Why is it that the city, we don't ask the city to obtain this information from between our working group and London Hydro? It just seemed to me that we are skipping the step of the people who are involved with the entire project. So I'd like an answer for that, because it just seemed to me that we should ask our city staff to do this rather than going to London Hydro.
I think the most appropriate person to address your question would be the mover of the motion. Why he's crafted the motion this way. I'm going to hand things over to Councillor Van Holst.
My brief answer is that the city's not in a position to comment on the impact to the ratepayers because they know, London Hydro knows how those impacts come about. So they would be able to tell you, based on their estimates of what the cost might be for the capital works, they would be able to estimate how that might affect the ratepayers and the hydro bill. That's why I'm looking to London Hydro for that information.
Any other speakers? Okay, I want to be clear about this, everyone. This is a motion where questions were asked from staff, answers were not able to be provided. There's 24 hours between now and the council meeting, and so I expect that we'll make a vote this evening based on the information that's available to us. I expect we'll have further discussion about this tomorrow evening based on information that can be provided from the city engineer, from Mr. Stanford, and from anyone else that can provide additional information. I'm sure that Mr. Stanford will be busy getting that information for us between now and then. So, if there are no additional speakers, I'll call the question on the motion before us.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 12-3.
Okay, colleagues, let's take a look at the agenda. Is there any additional business? Councillor Van Holst?
Yes, and sorry again for the later notice, but I have another motion that Councillor Squires agreed to second, and that was also, I guess, the one that our colleagues saw most recently when they looked on their email.
So this is the motion, I believe, that came to us at 4:13 this afternoon. Okay. Let's give everyone an opportunity to review this. I'm going to review it myself when it comes up on screen. I'll start a speakers list once the motion's... Well, there really hasn't been a formal motion even made at this point. So
I thought there was an email from the clerk about...
At 4:13 it came through, yeah, 4:13. On behalf of the mover and the seconder, I believe. So we'll wait for that to come up on screen. I'll give everyone an opportunity to review it. You might have to hit refresh.
What's that, were you expecting?
Okay, I see it up on screen. I'm just going to read it for anyone watching from home. The motion that's being moved by Councillor Van Holst and seconded by Councillor Squire, that the following items be referred to the Rapid Transit Implementation Working Group for discussion: the bus hailing web application being tested by the City of Belleville, the test of driverless shuttles performed by the City of Edmonton during the week of October 9th, and the potential rapid transit overlap with opportunities for London as part of the Autonomous Vehicle Innovation Network. And so that has been moved and seconded. Give me a moment. I'm going to confer with the city clerk. The Rapid Transit Implementation Working Group reports through Civic Works, and there is a Civic Works committee that's scheduled, I believe, for the end of October. It may be more appropriate for this direction to be provided there. So give me a moment while I confer with the clerks to make a ruling on this motion. Okay, the Rapid Transit Implementation Working Group is under the jurisdiction of Civic Works. So what I'm going to recommend to the mover and the seconder is that you bring this forward by way of letter to the next CWC, and it can be added to the agenda and the direction can be provided at that time.
Happy to do so, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Any other additional business? I think we just set a record. Okay. Let's look then for confidential. We're headed into our confidential session. A couple of members, I believe, have just caught my attention to outline a potential conflict. And so these are all of the matters that are listed on the public agenda. I'll go to Deputy Mayor Hubert. Anyone else?
I'll be declaring a conflict on 6-1 in confidential session.
Anyone else? Councillor Turner?
I as well will declare conflict on 6-1 in confidential session.
Okay, so looking for a mover to move into confidential session, moved by Councillor Van Hol, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. Any discussion? I think we're meeting in Committee Room 3. It's more than likely that we'll adjourn from Committee Room 3 as well once we deal with these matters. Any speakers? Okay, let's call the question. All those in favor? Should I do it online? Yep. Okay, it's on screen. The efficiencies of government. We're voting.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 14-0.
See you all in Committee Room 3. And again, any members of the public, we're likely to just adjourn from the committee room. We'll make sure that we notify anyone in attendance here at City Hall prior to doing so.